Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Christina Wyckoff. I am the Section 106 coordinator and historical archaeologist at the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. And today's Lunch and Learn is Turning Records into an Archive, a reflection on the Oklahoma Black Homesteader Project. Dr. Kalenda Eaton is our presenter. Dr. Eaton is the Director of Oklahoma Research for the Black Homesteaders Project and an Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. She's a humanities scholar focused on African American Western studies, intersections of Black literacy and gender studies, African American social and cultural history, and Black diaspora studies. She's known for her teaching and public scholarship on what the experiences of African Americans living on the Great Plains can tell us about American culture and national politics. Welcome, Dr. Eaton.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this invitation and this opportunity. And I want to thank first the Preservation Office and, of course, you, Christina, for the invitation, and also the Oklahoma Historical Society. And also the work that we do on this project would not be possible without support from the National Park Service, the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and my home university, the University of Oklahoma. And I would also like to thank the countless individuals and families and their descendants whose legacies we honor. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video so that we can focus on the slides. So you'll hear my voice and then I'll come back at the end. The Oklahoma Black Homesteader Project acknowledges that through the process of homesteading, non tribal affiliated Black immigrants entered a tangled web of racist and settler colonial practices that had been negatively affecting Indigenous communities in North America for centuries. And through research, one learns that it was very clear early on that those similar practices often limited Black mobility in these same spaces and made being a Black homesteader challenging and often precarious in ways that it was not for other ethnic groups. Overall, this project engages with and reinterprets earlier scholarship on Black migration and mobility throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. In the vein of Carter G. Woodson's A Century of Negro Migration, published in 1918, research on African American mass movement into Oklahoma territory is highlighted in early 20th century scholarship by Arthur Tolson, Moselle C. Hill, and later Daniel Littlefield and Lonnie Underhill. Shirley Ann Wilson Moore, Quintard Taylor, Hannibal Johnson, and others should also be noted for their continued emphasis on the presence in the Oklahoma Territory and the wider West. The histories of the homesteading communities and experiences of the individuals we highlight is rich, diverse, and varied, and speaks to the uniqueness of our state. For example, the 19th century saw Creole enclaves, single and widowed Black women working to create generational wealth, descendants of those who were enslaved inside and outside of Indian territory, entrepreneurs, territorial politicians, religious leaders, educators, and more connected through rural farming communities created through the homesteading process. When Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862, the federal government offered eligible settlers 160 acres of government land after they completed several requirements. For example, those eligible were male citizens of the United States over age 21, war veterans of any age, widows and single women, and married women who were listed as heads of households. Also, eventually, new immigrants into the US were allowed to participate in the program if they stated an intent to become a citizen. Although race was allegedly not a factor, there are examples in archival documents that demonstrate this may have been less of an equitable decision and more of an assumption that non white citizens would not, and in most cases could not, take advantage of the act when it was passed. Therefore, on the homesteading filing forms, there is no place to mark racial identification, even though racial categories were used for federal census records in other instances. For example, between 1860 and 1880, the census racial categories were listed as white, Black, mulatto, Indian, and Chinese. The lack of racial identification on the filing forms becomes important when attempting to search for Black homesteaders in the General Land Office and related databases. In short, even though the GLO seems like the logical first step, we cannot begin there. So, who is a homesteader? Colloquially, the terms homestead and homesteader are used in general to define houses and adjacent land. Privately owned, often purchased from the government and connected to self sufficient agricultural production. For this reason, the Oklahoma Black Homesteader Project has been approached by a few people who tell us their relatives were homesteaders. But when further research is conducted, we may find that though they had a generally defined homestead or farm, it was not obtained through the Federal Homestead Act. So, to clarify, the model we are using defines a homesteader as someone who filed a claim under the Federal Homestead Act, including those who either proved up their claim or those who decided to shorten the initial process and pay cash. Proving up a claim typically included living on the plot for 5 years uninterrupted, showing evidence of improvement, filing a claim, gathering witnesses, submitting verification statements, publishing a public intent to file, and paying a small filing fee, but not in that order. And of course, receiving the final patent. Due to the rich and complex history of Oklahoma, we have limited the geographic area to the western portion of the state in what was known as the Oklahoma District. This is where the bulk of the claims were filed under the Federal Homestead Act. We also see this project as an opportunity to highlight vacant or forgotten African American communities that may otherwise be overlooked or condensed in larger state and national histories. And so the multi-phase project that we're working on includes a mixed methods approach with both quantitative lists of names and census records and qualitative analyses. The phases include data collection, cataloging and assessment, archival research. We will conduct oral history interviews, use geographic information system software for mapping, including aerial images. We're creating a digital archive and database and public-facing presentations, including talks such as this one. There will also be exhibits and displays and much more. Throughout the process, one of our primary goals is to provide a central location for the public to access documents pertaining to Black homesteading in the state. For example, this will be valuable for those interested in state history, American history, genealogical research, rural Black communities, domestic immigration, rural education, Western studies, journalism and media history, women's studies, and many other subjects. And to understand the migration and settlement, forced and voluntary, of African Americans throughout the centuries, that is to begin to understand the development of the nation. So you see the highlighted part here on this particular slide, and that says creating a digital archive. And that's really kind of the focus of what I want to talk about today. We started with a few counties, names of long gone communities and cemeteries. Through the process of conducting research and mining collections and cross-checking in databases and reading through files that were scanned at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and also visiting research centers and being contacted by descendants who hold documents, it became very apparent that a Black homesteader archive needed to exist. In August 2021, I gave an interview with the OU Daily about this project, and I stated, overall, I was drawn to this project because many narratives and histories about Black Oklahomans still exist within families, federal documents, and in communities, but little attention has been paid to this material. At the time that I made the statement, I was not thinking about creating an archive. I was focused on finding information to help tell these stories. And I knew Black Oklahomans kept their own histories and would know where to begin. As a researcher and student of Black cultural history, I understand the Western model of the archive has limitations because historically African American history has been deemed unimportant or in many cases non-existent. And over the centuries, the official repositories have not collected the documents, ephemera, and cultural heritage artifacts in ways that would be meaningful to specific communities. Of course, this has begun to change as institutions have become more aware of their own blind spots and more conscientious while moving forward. But there is still much work to be done to address the past. William Henry Dorsey was an everyday citizen and famed scrapbooker who lived in Philadelphia in the 19th century. He created an archive of close to 400 scrapbooks filled with clippings on African American life, and they resided in his home and with family for decades until they eventually made their way to a university in the next century. When discussing Dorsey's life and mission to save Black lives through literally saving evidence of African American life experiences and achievements, Cynthia Greenlee states, Dorsey's work spans the esoteric and the everyday and serves as an invaluable record of Reconstruction's promise and failure and the nation changing journey of Black people from chattel to citizens. The story of Black homesteading in Oklahoma is also a commentary on Reconstruction in America, as well as the role increased mobility, meaning upward mobility and also geographic location, played in the restructuring of Black families, political participation, education, and yes, everyday lives. Studying this history highlights how and why Oklahoma, like Kansas before it, was deemed a promised land and a paradise in the Black popular imagination and prompted as such and promoted as such in pamphlets and also newspapers. In his work, David Scott notes that an archive is the dense network of illusions, events, concepts, images, stories, figures, personalities that inhabit the subterranean of statements, animating them, giving them sense as well as force. And because the archive is not in any simple way already there, waiting to be read, it has at once to be recovered and described in order to be put to critical use. And this is the work of the archaeologist. Through that recovery and description, it is given new meaning, and therefore the archival documents remain current in the present and relevant in the future. Public-facing scholarship is part of our process of retrieving documents and making them legible for the wider public. If we look here on this particular slide, these are some examples of recent public-facing scholarship relevant to what we've been doing with the Oklahoma Black Homesteader Project. I have the Lunch and Learn that we are all participating in today, and then also examples of other talks that have been given, a podcast where I gave an interview, and other presentations, and we also have a social media presence. And so this attempt to document the process as we are going through it also, I think, is very important when we're thinking about what it means to create an archive and to cite of these findings. So I want to shift a bit here to some of the preliminary findings that we have. So although the Homestead Act was in effect in 48 contiguous states until 1976, our focus date range is from 1889 to 1920. To date, we have verified over 1,000 African American heads of household who were homesteaders in the way described earlier and living across Western counties. Approximately half lived in Kingfisher, Oklahoma counties, Logan counties, Lincoln counties, and Blaine. And over 100 women have been shown to have proved up on their homestead claims. The document that I have here on the right is an official certificate with the president's signature. And I want to draw attention to the language of ownership. And I don't know if you can see it fairly well, but it says that to have and to hold the said tract of land with the appurtenances therefore unto the said Matilda Branner and to her heirs and assigns forever. And that language there really speaks to kind of the importance of property ownership in general, but also land ownership and what that meant, not only for the person who went through the process of homesteading, kind of participating within the homesteading process, but also for those who would come after. So the descendants, the heirs. Another example here is Victoria Celestine, who has documents where we have examples of how the process is very varied for everyone. For example, in her testimony and the testimony of one of the witnesses, it's explained why she goes by two different names. Her husband was from Louisiana and went by both the Celestine surname and also an alias of Pelaire. We learned from the documentation that he was an Army veteran. And so the claim that she files is for land that already had a home built on it, which was not always common. Often homesteaders were kind of starting from scratch and building their own homes. And this home was there before she arrived. She purchased the house and estimates that it has a value of about $300. She also notes that she's worked on the land for 7 seasons, and this is also attested to by the witness, and that she has been successful in improving upon the land. Other interesting parts, I think, of this particular document are the fact that she is a widow. And so she's therefore head of household, but she also has 7 children. And so this is important because in our numbers that, the over 1,000 number of heads of households that I mentioned before, that does not include the children, right? Only those who filed and went through the process. So if we consider the Celestine case here, one person actually equals 8 people, right? So one homesteader actually equals 8 people who are kind of benefiting from and participating from the homesteading process. These other slides that follow are examples of homesteading affidavits, receipts, and witness statements for Green Curran. And many of you know Curran as a well-known figure in Oklahoma politics. He was born in Tennessee, becomes a political figure in Kansas, and moves into Oklahoma Territory at the time of the opening of lands in 1889, and he moves into Kingfisher County. Curran was the first African American to serve in the Oklahoma Territorial Legislature, and he famously introduced the first civil rights bill in 1890 that would prevent African Americans from attacks. But although it passed the Assembly, it failed the Senate by 1 vote. I include Curran and these documents for 2 reasons. One, because he is well known, but maybe not as well known as a homesteader. And 2, because he's also an example of the role homesteading plays in creating opportunity and generational wealth for many African Americans in the territory. For example, this homesteading certificate here is for one of his sons, Henry, who initially leased land, but then eventually received his own plot. And history tells us that Henry and his brother also had a candy store in Tulsa and also a location in Guthrie. And their candy store in Tulsa was actually uh, destroyed during the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so he then moves from Tulsa back to the Guthrie area. And the research that's done by Shayla Moon and others notes that he was kind of devastated by the massacre and by the loss of his business, and never really kind of got over that, right? So this is kind of one of those long arcs to show that, you know, his father as a homesteader and politician, and then Henry as a homesteader, is then tied to later Oklahoma history on the eastern portion of the state in Tulsa and the Tulsa Race Massacre, and then, you know, comes back to Guthrie. And so there are these connections that often we don't make within Oklahoma history between homesteading and maybe some of the other important events and movements that are happening later. This next slide here just kind of talks about some of the general data collection challenges. For example, there is a lot of census illegibility and several transcription errors that don't necessarily make it easy to do this work. There's also limited search flexibility in the GLO patent database. There's a spelling mismatch, and the postdoctoral associate on this project, Dr. Heidi Dodson, has noted that there's roughly between a 33% and a 37% spelling mismatch on the within the databases. Women homesteaders may have remarried, and so trying to kind of find them with their maiden names versus, say, their married names is not necessarily a simple process. Also, there are a lot of boundary changes within Oklahoma in terms of the county boundary changes, and then also over time throughout the early territorial census, and then throughout the censuses that we have access to once Oklahoma becomes a state. You have also name changes of the different counties. Several counties change their names. There's census undercounting, which is fairly common. And then homesteaders may be absent from a particular census due to death or migration out of the state. For example, there's a large movement of Black Oklahomans out of Oklahoma into Canada. And this happens between 1906 and about 1912. You have others who are moving back and forth across borders like Arkansas or Texas. And so there can then be people who aren't captured in a census, but who had been homesteaders for a while, or at least within that 10-year period. And then also another kind of general challenge is the limited access to data analysis software that would make mixed methods analysis kind of a simpler process. And so a lot of the work is done and has been done by hand rather than through the software that is available, but also the software is not as widely available for mixed methods research and or qualitative research as it is for quantitative. And so that's something else. It's just kind of a general challenge. Some Oklahoma specific research observations that I've made is that the terms Black and homesteader together are not recognized search queries in most of the databases that I have accessed. And so that can pose a challenge, right, when we're kind of thinking about ways of identifying Black homesteaders in certain counties and certain parts of the state. This concept of Black homesteading is one that, you know, is discussed in literature and is discussed kind of more informally, but in terms of how that has been categorized and or cataloged, it's not necessarily always kind of evident. And maybe people are identified as farmers, or they're just identified as kind of living in a particular county, but not known as a homesteader specifically. And so we have to try and figure out, is this person a homesteader? Black homesteading and the Black town movement are often collapsed into one within Oklahoma history, and also the way in which these research databases are created and accessed. There's kind of this emphasis on the Black town movement, which is very important, and very intricately connected to Black homesteading in many ways. But the Black homesteading movement is a separate movement, but it's not always accounted for. There's also a lack of detailed archival information about migration into the state. So there is kind of general information about people moving into the state, and within, say, for example, the Encyclopedia of Oklahoma History, there's information about people who moved into the state, either whether they participated in a particular land run or not, but kind of what that means on a kind of detailed level, and how we find or access information about these migrations within the archives is a little bit different. Something else I've observed is that the county historical societies hold very valuable information that often maybe they don't even know they have. And so that could be images, photographs of early African-American farmers in rural areas. Some of those people may have been homesteaders.
Kalenda, I think your sound went out for just a second. I just want to make sure you're still there.
Yes, I'm here. What was the last thing you
Perfect. I can hear you again. County historical societies hold valuable information.
Okay. That's the last thing I said, so that's good. So county historical societies hold valuable information. I was saying that often they don't know that the information that they hold and how it could be important to researchers. There could be photographs of farmers who were homesteaders, and other documentation that may not necessarily be labeled as homesteading documentation. The origins of several existing communities are often lost and often misunderstood. So, for example, there are communities that were founded as Black homesteading communities, but then eventually, over time, due to a changing demographic, are no longer, say, predominantly Black, or have even a significant Black population, if any at all. And so, kind of how those counties came to be, how those communities came to be, and kind of the importance of their origin can be lost sometimes. Also, there are several heritage sites and also filing forms associated with those sites that don't necessarily always include Black or African American as possible categories for identification. And then also the last thing I will say, just in terms of some of these observations, are that Black Indian freedmen allotments and homesteads exist in a very separate space because of different government structures, different territorial laws. And so while often people ask, are we including Black Indian freedmen allotments and Black Indian freedmen homesteads in this project, I tried to make it very clear that we are focusing on what is known as Oklahoma Territory and Western Territory, in the western portion of the state. However, that work needs to be done, right? And that work definitely is important, but the resources that we have at this moment will not allow for that broader examination. So the last thing I'll say here is that as I'm thinking about the future, and as we think about the future with this project, and also just the ways in which we access Black heritage resources across the state of Oklahoma, It's also important to think about the different platforms and different ways of archiving. According to Lene Denise, contemporary digital platforms and grassroots communities of content creators explore the potential for digital archival storytelling beyond preservation and documentation. And so there are these increased emphases on ethical archival practices, community led and collective recordings, recapturing African American lives and histories, and also social responsibility, kind of the responsibility that we all have as members of the public, as researchers, as those who are kind of creating our own archives and keeping our own family records, and also institutions. More often, a lot of this work exists outside of institutional repositories, but I would argue that it doesn't have to be an either or equation, and that the ways that institutions work with communities is very important and is key to preserving Black heritage resources now and also moving forward. I think I'll stop here. We're at the 31-minute mark. And I will ask if there are any questions or if anyone wants to engage in discussion. Thank you.
So while we wait for some additional questions to populate here, I wanted to quickly, well, let me ask you this one that Rolene has offered. Uh, as someone unfamiliar with the Black Towns movement, could you share more information?
So the Black Towns movement is generally defined as the uh, creation of Black towns, all Black towns in Oklahoma. We have about 50 or so that have been identified across the state, and currently there are about 13 that remain, and the majority are in eastern Oklahoma and Indian Territory, and so each town is very different. But overall, there was a national movement to kind of obtain land and create communities of African Americans and people of African descent who would be able to benefit from the economic resources, educational resources, professional resources of other members of the community. And so Oklahoma was a very attractive location during kind of this larger national Black town movement and these migrations out of the South and out of the Midwest into the West, because first of all, it was the new territory in the early part of the 20th century, but also in terms of kind of the promotion and the ways in which Oklahoma was described, and Indian Territory even before that was described. It was a place where African Americans and people of African descent could feel safe and kind of be a part of an upwardly mobile, progressive territory where they could escape some of the dangers of Jim Crow. This changed drastically after 1907, but that was some of the kind of initial impetus for the movement. You're unmuted, Christina.
Thank you. Shay asks, how many of the families you spoke with still have the properties that their ancestors homesteaded, if any?
So the next phase of the process actually is moving into some of the oral history interviews and descendant interviews. We have not kind of gotten to that point yet, but also we don't have a sense of how many people are still on these original lands. We do know, based on our research on the kind of the communities in general and where they were located, that the majority of these communities no longer exist. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that the individual plots of land are not still in the family. But overall, the communities have changed in many different ways, and they've either been annexed or just kind of are land, farmland, or whatever the case may be. That's why I think this project is so important, because especially when we get to the kind of mapping and the aerial images and the GIS mapping, because there are a lot of spaces where there just is a cemetery, but then nothing else around it. And people may drive, by that cemetery every day and not think anything of it, and not realize that that cemetery was tied to a church that no longer exists, which was tied to a school, which was tied to several farming homesteads and communities that kind of tell this richer story. So we're in the process of uncovering all of that.
We have several great questions. I'm going to jump around a little bit though and ask. Lauren O'Shea asks, I would love to use the interactive website to do some background research. Is it available? And could you share the link?
Almost. So we are, as I was saying before, this is a multi-phase project. And so we are moving into those phases of, kind of working through and creating the website. That's actually a later phase. And that is dependent upon kind of, I guess I should say, how extensive that website is going to be dependent on our initial funding. We are in the process of actually applying for additional funding to kind of create a much larger version of what we thought we were going to do in the beginning. And it's interesting that you asked that question, because as we have been kind of working through the data collection and kind of working through the analysis and understanding kind of the full scope of what's happening and what was happening in Oklahoma, we then have shifted, right, the way that we've been moving about in this project. So in the beginning, it was going to be kind of a small site that was going to be tied to an existing homesteading site on the National Park Service server, where they're just kind of a few names of people and a blurb about what was happening in Oklahoma during the period. But over the past year and a half, it has become very apparent that there needs to be something more. And that's what I was saying in the beginning about, kind of this creation of an archive. And that's why I wanted to title the presentation Turning Records into an Archive, because we were thinking about records and record keeping and identifying where these records were and using the information to, disseminate kind of these stories to the public. But it has become then a project where ultimately the goal is going to be to create a much larger digital archive. And so you'll have access to those interactive links and parts of that site as we are moving forward.
And maybe we could share a link to where people can find more information about the project as it progresses.
Yes, so we have a Twitter page. We have a Twitter account, and that's at Okla BHP. And then we have a website, which is housed at the University of Nebraska through the Oklahoma Black Homesteader Project link. And that particular site provides information about the team, the research team, and then any kind of public talks that we give that are virtual, we'll put there, and then other updates about the project. And so this is kind of a separate site than what I was speaking about in terms of kind of the interactive, actual official Black Homesteader Project site. And we also have an email address as well, as you see there on the screen. And so there are multiple ways of following the project as it progresses, but also getting in contact with any of us.
So we have several questions asking about how people could potentially be involved in the project as volunteers. Does the project allow for volunteer assistance?
Absolutely. And so I would say that most effective way to let us know that you're interested is to email us. I know it seems very kind of old school, but but if you email us, we can have a record of your request. And also, there's a link on the website that exists right now. If you follow that URL, and if you, for example, are the descendant of a homesteader, or you have information and you would like to contribute, there's also a space. I forgot to say, there's also a space for you to tell us about your story and your family story, so we can incorporate that into the larger project.
So we also have some questions about built environment resource buildings that might be on the site of these homesteads. Do you have any information about that? And are folks with the Homestead Project familiar with the way our office, perhaps the State Historic Preservation Office, documents buildings and considers them for National Register eligibility?
So the answer to the first question is that there are a few a few locations that we have noted that do have buildings. They are not in use. They are not even usable. And so some of these buildings are fairly dilapidated, or we just kind of have the frame of the building. And so I don't know if that would count. I'm asking you, Christina, in terms of the process and kind of the way in which you identify particular and label particular buildings throughout the state. Other buildings we have yet to kind of move through all of these different locations and counties. So we're not sure about the other buildings, but the ones that I do know of are not habitable at all. And they just, again, kind of speak to a time before. I would love to, at some point later in this project, have markers actually located where these communities were. And I know about that process through the state, but I'm not as familiar with the process that the person asked about, because we're not dealing with kind of a lot of uh, kind of established edifices at this point. It's just more of kind of land at this point, and also kind of locating and plotting out boundaries within counties.
I have lots of additional questions but I'm going to look at some of the other ones. Yes, as far as dilapidated ruins could certainly be documented. They would likely be documented as ruins instead of as a building if they were missing a roof. But more on that later, I suppose. Let's see. How many Black towns have historical markers is a question. Do you have an answer to that?
I don't know. In fact, there's there's a lot of work happening right now with the Black towns in Oklahoma. I know Senator Kevin Matthews is spearheading this, and there are the Black town mayors who get together and are focusing on kind of ways of uh, acquiring resources to kind of help with that process of identifying, of course, creating markers. I know there's a talk of a heritage trail. And so that's outside of the scope of this particular project, but there's a lot of work happening right now in the state with the Oklahoma Historical Society, with the Senator Matthews' office. Also, students have been interning. I know some have come from my university and kind of participating in the work, the research, and the work that's being done to identify. To include rather markers in those particular towns and communities, but that's outside of the scope of my project.
Let's see, let me go to this one. What led you with the project to start with Western Oklahoma in documenting these homesteads? This is Brenda Lowe. She says, growing up in Oklahoma in the 50s and 60s, people highlighted communities in the eastern part of the state.
Yes. So the Oklahoma Black Homesteader Project is really thinking about homesteading in the way that it was defined through the Federal Homestead Act. And so the majority of the properties that were kind of acquired through the Federal Homestead Act are in Western Oklahoma, because we have that divide that is. Let me go back here to the beginning that I have here on the map. Sure there's an easier way of doing this. You did show me at some point, I forgot what it was. But the divide between Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory. And so because Indian Territory, of course, as there's tribal sovereignty and it's protected, even though the entire state, of course, was Indian Territory prior to the renegotiation of treaties and the land grabs. You have then this portion here on the western side of the state that then becomes kind of newly acquired federal land, and then that land is made available for homesteading. And so the people who are moving into the state of Oklahoma from other states and territories are coming into the primarily African Americans who are moving into are coming into Oklahoma territory. Not to say people were not moving all throughout Indian Territory as well, but in terms of as it is defined through the Federal Homestead Act, that whole process of proving upon the claim, et cetera, and petitioning, to the government and the affidavit and all that, that's happening more so on the Oklahoma Territory side. So that's why that's our focus.
Another attendee asks, do you know the population of Black homesteaders prior to statehood?
We are so yes, the answer is yes, but I can't give you that number right now because we're looking over. We have data that covers um, four different um, decades, and so we have that data kind of divided by decade. And off the top of my head, I mean, I don't have it in front of me. I can't tell you exactly how many were prior to statehood. But you have, you have a significant number prior to statehood of that, over 1,000 heads of household that I mentioned. But you have quite a few, of course, who take advantage of the opportunity between about 1910 and 1920. But you have far more prior to statehood.
We have another question from Pat Smith, who asks when record keeping started for Black homesteaders, and says they asked about Black homesteaders in about 2005 and was told there were none. I wonder if this might be you were talking earlier about how the documentation, the actual documentation, didn't allow for racial descriptors, and so I don't know if that may be related to this, but.
Absolutely. I don't know if the question is asking about Black homesteaders generally or Black homesteaders in Oklahoma, but either way, there have been projects that some funded by the National Park Service, some just funded by other entities, where people have done exactly what we're doing and kind of going into the archives and pulling out names and communities, and then cross-checking those names with census records, trying to identify who actually is considered Black or mulatto. That's another thing we're using both of those terms. And then even though it's a very archaic and kind of antiquated term, that's a term that was used in the census. And then also we have to cross-check those individuals with the General Land Office records. So, it's an entire process that's very kind of tedious, but it's necessary, right, for every single individual. And so I can't answer the question in terms of kind of when people overall started tracking these individuals. I know that from our experience, we don't have access to any established archive where this work has been done before. And so a lot of what we're doing is providing that information, or sorry, creating the archive so that we can provide that information to the public, so that 20 years from now or 30 years from now, when someone asks the question, who are the Black homesteaders in Oklahoma? How many were there? Where were they? They'll be able to then say, okay, this is where they are. This is how many they were. This is, the database.
Absolutely. Pat, I hope that helps to answer your question. Austin Curtis asks if you know where most Black homesteaders resided prior to coming to Western Oklahoma.
So yeah, we've been doing a little bit of kind of tracking in terms of migration, and it's very, I mean, it's evident through the census records, but of course, census records are not completely accurate. I'm thinking about my own family. I have my great grandfather. Says he's from about 3 different places on 3 different censuses. So I mean, we understand that they're not necessarily always accurate, but right now that's kind of the most accurate record we have until we then get into further research with the individuals and kind of find these other documents that make up the fuller picture. But anyway, so with those patterns, we've seen people coming from Tennessee, a lot of people coming from Tennessee, and that also tracks with homesteading in places like Kansas as well. So a lot of people are coming from Tennessee. A lot of people are coming from Kentucky. People are coming, especially in the early part of the homesteading movement in Oklahoma, they're coming out of Kansas. So you have large populations that are coming from Kansas. You have people who are coming up from Texas, and you also have movement into Texas, but you have a significant number who are coming from Texas as well. And then you have other, kind of smaller populations that are coming from Missouri or Arkansas, right, which are very close in border states. And so those are some of the patterns that we've seen thus far. And then you'll have, a group of people, a group of neighbors, that come from Louisiana or something. And then, you'll have these little pods of people. But in terms of large numbers, they're coming from the states that I mentioned.
Another question regarding homestead patterns requiring evidence of improvements. Did Oklahoma have general standards such as constructing a house and cultivating 10 acres? And has your research found that these improvement standards were applied fairly to Black homesteaders?
Is the question, well, I don't know if the question is about kind of post the process of proving upon the claim and receiving the patent and all of that. So if that's the question, I don't know about that part in terms of after, but I know that during the process of actually, kind of becoming eligible to obtain the land after the 5 years or 3 years, depends on how people whether they commuted their claims or what have you. But anyway, throughout that process, there was a kind of a federal checklist. But after that process, and after kind of the patent is distributed, so to speak, and you have the certificate, and the land is yours. I'm not sure about what the requirements were for Oklahoma, if there were any outside of taxes and kind of just general upkeep. But it's a great question, and we can definitely start to move towards some of those questions after. And also, I think another thing I want to say, because I know I'm looking at the time, so I don't know how much more we have for questions. But another thing I want to say quickly is that I hope, my greatest hope is that these presentations and the information that we provide, the work that we're doing actually excites people and gets more people interested in doing this work as well. So I don't want it to seem as if, we're, the only people who are going to be the the stewards of Black homesteading in Oklahoma. Absolutely not. I'm excited and honored to be a part of this phase, right? This initial phase of it. But a lot of these questions that are being asked are wonderful avenues for further research, for further, exploration, work. Teams of people can get together, and what have you. And so, absolutely, I mean, just please think about this project and projects like it as opportunities for you to become involved and contribute to the work.
We have one more question and then a couple of shares. Linda Ozan, our deputy SHPO, has shared a link to the existing Oklahoma Historical Society markers. And so anybody with questions about where those markers are can follow that link. And Rolene has shared another project. And then the last question that I see here is, does the Oklahoma Black Homesteader Project have any plans to work with archivists in Oklahoma to tag records that document the Black experience of migration and homesteading? And that may be sort of exactly what you were pointing to in your last answer.
I mean, that is the dream, right? To have this work positively influence the existing records. And so when I was saying earlier in the presentation that there's kind of a lot of work that needs to be done to address the past, even though we're thinking about, of course, how these archives are so important to the present and the future, that's a part of it, right? Actually, kind of going back into what exists and saying, okay, what are ways that we can kind of better tag, to use the term, better tag some of these documents so that it's easier for people to conduct this research, and maybe they're not told, oh, well, it doesn't exist, right? Because it always exists. It always exists, right? How it's identified, how we find it may not necessarily be kind of the same way, and it may not be a clean process, but the information exists. Whether it's in somebody's attic, whether it's in, the OHS, it's there. But that tagging is very important, and identifying what is there and how to kind of highlight that is a part of what I hope the kind of larger product of this project is and can be.
We may have time for part of an answer to this last question.
Okay.
Can you speak to the digital archive phase of the plan? Are there any challenges that you've encountered?
The primary challenge that we have right now has to do with resources, so human resources, financial resources, and then also kind of deciding what the platform will be, in terms of where this will be hosted. And those are typical challenges with any, digital archive. So I'm not saying that that's particular to our project, but it's just, those are some of the kind of primary challenges that we have. There are a lot of opportunities out there to kind of apply for funding, different types of funding that can sustain these types of archival projects, but there's always these questions about, what happens 30 years from now, what happens 40 years from now, right? In terms of the digital archive, when it's, passed on to the next steward, what will that look like? And so, I mean, those are kind of some more general archiving questions, but with the digital aspect of it, when we're talking about servers, you're talking about technology, you're talking about things that, may change or often does change and may not necessarily exist in the same way. Those are just kind of, general challenges.
I'm going to switch your slide here to show everybody the website link again, so everyone knows where they can find more information. There's a couple of additional notes that I'll just read. Larry Odell from our building, the Historical Society, put nice signs at each of the 13 historical Black towns. And then Austin asks where we can learn more about this time period in Oklahoma for Black homesteaders and history, and if you have any recommendations for other people to read beyond this presentation and project.
So, yes, and one of the links on the website actually is a further research link. And so people can access what is there. And I kind of update that as more relevant information pops up. So that's a place. And thank you, Larry, for mentioning that. I have been to all of the Black towns and I have seen those signs, but I guess I was thinking about, I thought the person was asking about kind of historical markers that would be on the side of the road or something. And so, but yes, actually, yeah, absolutely. All of the towns do have a sign, signs with the history and images and what have you. Um, but I think the project, what I was thinking about before was this kind of project to provide more signage in terms of just kind of on the main roads and thoroughfares, so people would know to get to and how to get to those particular towns. So thank you for that clarification.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to. I'm going to stop with the questions now, but thank you so much for taking time out of your day to present this research. It's very important research to us and to our audience, and we're so grateful to have had you. And hope we can see more from you as this project continues to progress.
Thank you. We definitely will be in touch with the preservation office, and of course, we're always in touch with the historical society. So yes, you'll be hearing a lot more from us as we continue on. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone.